Howdy folks, this is Big Sam. Welcome back to Dragoon Week, where we take a look at really interesting Dragoons and a lot of cool info about them. Now today is going to be pretty interesting. I got a real treat for you. We've got another Dragoon, a really cool rifle here we're going to take a look at, but first, we're going to take a look at a really interesting postcard. This was something that I found a little while ago, and I thought it was pretty relevant to Dragoon Week because it has some really interesting soldiers in it who probably aren't actually Dragoon troops, but have Dragoon rifles. So let's go ahead and take a look at it because I know y'all are going to want to see this. Alright, so here we have actually a really interesting postcard. And this is not typically what you think of when you think of a Dragoon regiment. And that's probably because this is probably not a Dragoon regiment. Now, what exactly are we looking at here? Well, we want to look at these guys' markings on their uniforms. And if we zoom in, we see an interesting symbol. See that rascal right there? That appears to mean that this is some sort of railway brigade. And it appears the number here says 2. So this might be something like the 2nd Railway Brigade of the Imperial Russian Army. Seems like we also see that number here as well. Although if you look over here, don't really see, it looks like a 0, so it's kind of hard to tell. But we do see these these cross markings right here. It looks like a crossed pickaxe and maybe something else, maybe a hammer. We definitely, though, see the 2 here and here. So that's a pretty good indication of that. So why are we looking at Imperial Russian a railway brigade soldiers in a postcard? Well, mainly because we're looking at 2 rifles. And the first one, of course, is right here. We can see that, of course, is a Mosin, but it's not just any Mosin. This is Dragoon Week, folks. Of course, I'm going to show you pictures of Dragoons. So if we zoom in here, we can see right here we have our Konovalov rear sight. So that means this is going to be probably a Dragoon, a Cossack, or an M91 rifle. Okay, now right away we can already look right here. There's our barrel band. And then right here, we can see the end of the handguard, okay? Now remember, the original Dragoon handguards, they would extend to the sides of the sight base going all the way around and then back on both sides like that. So it would go around. We don't see that here. This looks like very much like the handguard we saw in our last episode looking at that 1895 Dragoon. And it's really hard to tell, but it seems like right there might be one of those brass rivets. Okay, now we see our barrel band here. That tells us this is not an M91 rifle. So this is either going to be a Dragoon or a Cossack rifle at this point. Now if we go up, we see our front Dragoon type barrel band. And we go all the way up. What is this thing? That, folks, is a socket-style bayonet that we looked at in our last video. And of course, that can only mean one thing, folks. This is a Dragoon rifle, because Cossacks wouldn't have had bayonets affixed to them. Okay, so why do these guys have Dragoon rifles if they're a railway brigade? Well, that's a really good question. But this is our first point I want to illustrate in this series of why Dragoon rifles weren't just used by Dragoon troops, okay? It's sort of a relatively, I guess, common misconception. But when you think Dragoon, you don't necessarily want to think of the guys on horsebacks when we're talking about the Dragoon Mosin, okay? And this picture is a perfect illustration why. Now, I want to go back here because this is really interesting. Now, because we know this is Dragoon, we know that this is an Ijevsk-produced rifle. And you can even see right here, there we go. You can even see right here there's 2 lines of words. So up here, we can actually see it. This would be, it actually says Izhevsk right there, and this is where it's going to say Oruzheny, and on the other side it'll say Zavat. Okay, so you can actually see the words. You can't make out a whole lot else, so that's really cool that you can see that. This is a pretty high quality photo, especially given it's from Imperial Russia, pre-World War I. That's right, when was this from? Well, we'll look on the other side, but I think as far as we can tell, this might be from 1913, so just before World War I. That's pretty interesting. You can also see right here, it appears, see that line right there? That seems to be the sling on one of these rifles. And in fact, it could be that this is the sling going on the side as well, so that's pretty cool. Of course, there we have our typical butt plate, pretty normal stuff, but a really good, high-quality look at a Mosin Dragoon. But there's one more in this picture I want to show you guys, and it's right here on the edge. We see there's a little bit of an imperfection here, unfortunately, with the photo, but it doesn't really interfere with looking at this rifle at all. So we see here's this other guy right here. He's also has a Dragoon. How do we know it's a Dragoon? Because we have the barrel band, and the barrel band is all the way back here. On M91 rifles, the barrel band is basically at the very end of the handguard, okay? So when you don't see a barrel band at the end of a handguard, like this guy, when you see it over here, that tells us that, in fact, it is a Dragoon rifle instead of the alternative, which would be an M91 rifle. And, of course, there's our bayonet right here, so that tells us, again, this is a Dragoon rifle, not a Cossack rifle. Okay, and if we look here, this is also pretty cool. Kind of hard to see, but looks like there is probably the serial number on the rifle. I couldn't quite tell you what that is. Right there should be the Izhevsk bow and arrow, perhaps. Although with the matricing, it's kind of hard to tell. It probably should be up a little bit further, so that could be that. And then right here is actually going to be that Imperial crest on the receiver. How about that, folks? Pretty high fidelity. Okay, and what's also nice is you can see the slider is right here all the way back, so you can actually tell what sight setting the slider was at. Of course, very typical to see it essentially at the closest range, but again, not really close right here. That's probably at 400 arshins, which is not exactly what we would call close range. Of course, Finland later didn't really like that, so they had to add an extra notch on these rascals so they could be sighted in at a little bit more relatively closer range, such like 200 meters. Okay, so we see a bunch of dudes in here, and we have 2 of them with Dragoon rifles. And the other guys, I don't know where their guns are. They could be somewhere else. Now, it's possible these guys do have horses, but realistically, what did these guys do? That's the question we want to answer. Well, if they're on the railway, they were probably involved in either defense of the railway itself or construction or repair of the railway in some shape, form, or another. In fact, during World War I, these troops, just like these guys we're looking at here, produced thousands of kilometers and repaired thousands of kilometers, probably, worth of railroad tracks. Now, new construction versus repair, I'm not exactly certain which was which on that number, but we know in war there was probably a whole lot of both going on. It was not the greatest time to be alive, but these guys were very busy. They were also in charge of taking care of telegraph lines, which would, of course, run alongside a lot of the railroad tracks. So these guys were pretty busy. And on top of all the construction, they also were responsible for defense as well. So these were like really important guys, because when we talk about wars of attrition like World War I certainly was, The railroad is the lifeblood of an army because you have to have rapid resupply by rail in order to keep up with a war of constant attrition. You're having to constantly lose stuff and then resupply that stuff. And it's guys like this that kept basically the fronts from just totally collapsing. Now, in spite of all of this, we know that the Russians had a lot of logistical issues, but it wasn't necessarily, at least always, due to issues on the railroad itself, but it was more of like they just didn't have the supplies, the ammunition, or the guns to get to the troops. They certainly had a lot of railroad, though. So why would these guys had Dragoon rifles versus the standard M91 rifle if these guys weren't on horseback, which we think they were not? In fact, at least in the typical fashion we think of Dragoon troops, right? These guys, if they're doing constructions or anything like that, they're probably spending vast majority of their time dismounted from either horses or the trains themselves. So since they're having to do all of that, these guys aren't exactly what we would call frontline units, although they could have been, right? If the front came to a railway or if a railroad was attacked, these guys are going to have to defend it, right? With a Mosin Nagant Dragoon rifle, apparently. And maybe some kvass or vodka. But past that, they're going to be doing a lot more than just that, right? This is going to be construction. So if you're having to do all of that, it's sort of nice to not have to have a rifle that's quite as long as your standard massive Mosin M91 rifle that's with a bayonet affixed is taller than a lot of the guys that wield them. So I could definitely see why a Dragoon rifle would be preferred because it's a little bit shorter. That also begs the question, though, why not a Cossack rifle or a 1907 carbine? The first one I think is sort of obvious. These guys aren't Cossacks. The Cossack rifles we'll have to talk about another day. But they were more for the Cossacks themselves instead of these more formal units within the Russian army is what it seems. So I'm not surprised that these guys don't have Cossack rifles. But they certainly could have had 1907 carbine rifles. Now, why weren't they? Well, again, part of it could come down to logistics because they didn't make a ton of 1907 carbine rifles. And we'll look at pictures another day, but we see a lot of those rifles in use with artillery units and machine gun crews, but we don't see them here. Now, it's not to say that these guys didn't have 1907 carbines at all, because we see a lot of these guys, we don't even see their guns. We only see 2 guns, and we see a lot more than 2 guys in this picture. So they could be around. But the fact that these guys have the Dragoon rifles with bayonets does sort of tell me that perhaps, at least under certain circumstances, they were expected to be able to use the bayonets. Because remember, the bayonet was a huge part of Russian infantry doctrine. Okay, so that might tell us that these guys are more focused on infantry than we maybe even realize. So these guys definitely were expected to defend the railroads. It seems like they were definitely, they definitely saw some combat. Because if you have a 1907 carbine, that's generally more for the people that they don't really need a rifle. They don't really need a infantry rifle, but they need some sort of gun to protect themselves. The Dragoon rifles, however, fall into more of the category towards they are going to definitely see use, but we need something a little bit handier than the standard M91 rifle, because these guys are going to be a little bit more mobile and doing things that standard infantry units wouldn't. That's really where I see troops like this falling into place. But it's really interesting how high quality this photograph is. I mean, you really get a look into just a snapshot of the lives of all of these men. We don't know their names. But it's a little bit eerie that this was taken right before World War I started. The chances that a lot of these guys survived either the war or this Russian Civil War after that is not great. So these guys definitely, the the year and the couple years after this picture was taken, it was a very bad time to be alive for these poor guys. But I mean, this gives a real human aspect to the people that use these rifles. I mean, like, what is this? There's like a stone on top of a jar there. We've got a tea kettle there. I mean, you got a coffee mug there. There's all sorts of really interesting stuff in this picture. A couple guys in the background as well. We see these guys kind of like, what is going on there? They don't seem to care. This guy seems to be getting a real kick out of it. Yeah, a lot of these guys, you got to remember, even in 1913, couldn't even read. So if you're basically come from a subsistence farming family and you have no education, and all of a sudden you're given a high-tech Mosin rifle and you go to work on the railroad, and then you get a chance to have your actual picture taken, that is a big deal. So a lot of these guys come from different parts of the Russian Empire, some of them a lot more well-off than others, certainly. So some of these guys are definitely going to appreciate something like this a lot more. But there's one more interesting thing that's really particularly interesting about this particular postcard, which is the back. So let's take a look at why this guy is so interesting from just the perspective of where it's from and who it was to. Okay, so here's the back, and this is where things start to get really weird, folks. Now, as far as I can tell, I think this is written in Latvian, and unfortunately, I don't speak Latvian, so I don't have a very good understanding of what exactly is trying to be portrayed here in this letter. But if you know somebody that knows Latvian, definitely shoot me an email, and I'd like to get this translated to see what it says, who was writing this, and who is it to. Because you'll notice this is actually addressed to America, Minneapolis, Minnesota, in the United States. Okay, we'll get to that more in a second, but that's really interesting. Why was this sent to America, of all places? And where did it come from? Well, again, I think it came from Latvia somewhere. At least this guy was Latvian. Now, that kind of makes sense because Latvia at this time was part of Russia still, pre-Russian Revolution. So this is really still Russia, the Russian Empire, although there are definitely Latvian ethnicities within the Russian Empire. And now you notice here these stamps say, this is Baranovichi, which is a town in modern-day Belarus. So maybe this was mailed in Belarus. I mean, I know there's a lot of railroad activity today in Belarus. Maybe there was back then as well, especially in the Baranovichi area. Really hard to say, guys. But it definitely seems like this one was mailed. I mean, we see the Russian stamps here. Looks like there were 2 stamps on this particular guy. This really begs a question, though. Whoever this guy was, he obviously wanted to send it to America, probably had a relative there. Did it ever make it to America? I don't know. It did because it was mailed to Big Sam, but the thing is, I got this from, I believe this came from Estonia, actually. So it's really hard for me to tell you if, just from these, it was mailed, but the question is, did it actually make it to America? And then it maybe made it back to Estonia, and then it came back to America again? Or is this the first time it came to America? I don't really know. Now, it would be helpful to actually tell who this was sent to, because I think this is the name of the person this was mailed to, although I can't read that for the life of me, unfortunately. And I think right here, I think that just says America. And again, I could be wrong. But I think that's what it says. So if you have a better idea of what this says, let me know. Now, this is an interesting thing because we can actually look up this address today. And unfortunately, this 1808 14th Avenue South, Minneapolis, Minnesota, doesn't really exist anymore. So if you go in that area, there's a ton of really old houses in this area. Unfortunately, the 1808 house was demolished and replaced with a whole set of like apartments. But 1806 is still around, so the house right next to it. So you can actually still go there if you just type in 1806 14th Avenue South, Minneapolis, Minnesota. You can actually see who at least what the house looked like because it was right next to it. But it's really interesting to think somebody 100 years ago, almost 110 years ago, was living in that house, and somebody decided to send them a message. That's really interesting. If only we knew what the message said. So again, if you got any ideas on the translation, let me know. Like take a screenshot or something, and maybe we can figure out exactly what this says. But again, I think this is Latvian, although I could be wrong. I'm really, really bad at reading cursive, folks. Even in English, just forget about it. Okay, so of course this seems like a really appropriate thing to show for Dragoon Week. We found a weird postcard of a railway brigade of Imperial Russia using Dragoon rifles, and the postcard was mailed to America, probably. Although we don't know if it actually ever made it to this address or not. Really interesting. So now that we have a better understanding of this, let's go back and go ahead and take a look at our Dragoon of the day. Alrighty, folks, we got another cool Dragoon for you today. What we have here is, look at the barrel markings, an 1897 Izhevsk Dragoon rifle. And that makes sense because remember, in 1897, the only people making Dragoons were the Izhevsk factory. Okay. So that's pretty interesting. An 1897 rifle. So that puts this guy right at about, at least at the time of this video, 125 years old. That's pretty old, folks. We got our Imperial crest right there. We already know right off the bat this guy was used by Finland much later because we see that D marking right there on the barrel shank. We're not talking about Finland today. We're just taking a look at the Dragoon itself. See some kind of vague markings on the stocks. A lot of these have been sort of worn or just sanded down over time and refinished a little bit. So kind of hard to see a lot of that. But we can see we got our standard Dragoon escutcheons here. We can see right here, we've got, of course, our finished remarked rear sight. There we go, that's what I was trying to say. This is what, typically on Dragoons, it's very standard to see this type of handguard with the brass tabs. This is kind of you could almost call this a 9130 spec handguard, because it really could be. 9130s, at least the early ones, used handguards just like this. But this is also kind of correct for Dragoons, although not really in World War I itself. World War I, they were still using the earlier type that we saw in our last video, as well as we just saw in that really cool postcard. We can see we have our correct Dragoon barrel bands here, and we've got our Izhevsk bow and arrow. Now we have our little cutout here in the stock, so you can push it off, your barrel band off. So this is probably a later stock, would be my guess. Certainly not from 1897, but that's pretty typical. It's pretty hard to find stocks that are that old, much less the guns. Okay, we got our escutcheons again. That's pretty normal stuff. Then here's interesting, because we actually see this is a Dragoon barrel band, but we have a Tula hammer right there. Okay, well look, we'll talk about this more here later this week, but Tula did make Dragoon rifles, but not until after World War I. So this is a much later barrel band, although it is still technically correct for a Dragoon rifle. That's pretty cool. And we could see our Izhevsk bow and arrow right there on our barrel band spring. And up here we have a little bit of a different front sight than normal, because this is not the standard Imo Lottie designed front sight we typically see, which has the notch at the back. Not all of the Finnish front sights have that notch. Some of them they just made taller. So it seems like they had a few different patterns, and this is one of those different patterns that's not quite as common, but you still see them. It's just basically the standard style front sight with no notch at the back, but it's just taller than a standard Dragoon sight would be. Which, of course, coupled with the fact that we had those Finnish sight markings, that tells us this rifle, in its current setup, is sighted to be shot without a bayonet affixed, unlike when it was incepted in, of course, 1897. This particular one was made. We're going to flip this guy around here, and we're going to look at the other side. Really beautiful finish on this guy. Really nice patina. Really like the way this one looks, especially on the receiver. It's got some really nice charm, I guess you could call it. On most guns, it's not really great to have all this sort of like pitting going on here, but on Mosins, I actually like it. It's very minor. It probably isn't going to impact with anything from like a structural integrity. Probably, but again, I will never tell you your gun is safe to shoot. If yours looks like this, always have a gunsmith check it out. Well, this one has been verified though and checked out as safe to shoot. But I can't say anything about yours, unfortunately. That's just because we have a lot of lawyers, folks. And we can actually see right there in the light some of the old milling marks right there on the low wall style receiver. And that's really cool. Looks like somebody decided to engrave their initials in there or insert them. I don't know if that was someone in Finland or someone in Kentucky. We may never know, but it's interesting. It doesn't really look that bad. It looks very interesting, certainly. More of the same sort of pitting and just weird finish here on the top. The receiver looks really interesting. It has finish. I would more call it a patina, because a lot of Mosins like this will just have no finish. This one has a patina, which is not, I guess, super normal for ones like this. Okay, now what's missing here? Well, we talked about this a little in our last video, but in case you missed it, there's no sight markings here, and that's not normal. Why is that? We typically looked at M91 rifles with this old style rear sight base, right? And they always have sight markings, and generally when they're finished, they're crossed out. This rascal doesn't have anything. We just see right there is our Ijevsk bow and arrow. But past that, there's nothing. Well, remember from our last video, originally these guys had the handguard that wrapped around and it hugged the sides of the sight base, okay? Well, this guy doesn't have that anymore, but he originally did in 1897. And when he did, the sight graduations were basically engraved into the side of the wood of the handguard, not the sight base, okay? Now, the Cossack rifles should have had that on the sight base and the M91 rifles, but not originally the Dragoon rifles, as best as we can tell. And that's why we don't see it here. Now, on our last rifle, it originally didn't have them either. It was from 1895, but Russia came back later and re-added the markings. This one, though, they didn't for whatever reason. Probably because there was a horrible war going on and they just never got around to it. So, one of the really interesting things about Dragoons is, especially these older ones, the really old ones that originally had that one, so certainly the antiques, I guess I would say probably the whenever they got rid of that, and it's kind of hard to tell when they got rid of that, but probably around the time of the Russo-Japanese War, they, at least certainly after that, by the time that war had passed, they realized that's a really bad idea because they are fragile. So a lot of those got retrofitted. This one didn't, just another quirk of these. And we can see here, there's this little extra notch there cut in the sight base. Finland did that. They cut that notch there. That way we can sight in this rascal at, well, let's see, what was the setting on this guy? Is it 200 meters? Yeah, so see right there, it says that number 2, that's for 200 meters. That's pretty cool. Alright, this does have a force-matched bolt from Finland, and we know this is force-matched because this is actually a Tula-marked bolt. Not correct for an Izhevsk rifle, but hey, it works, it gets the job done, so I'm not complaining too much. This particular one has in fact been counterbored, which I don't know if I could even get this guy to focus or not. Maybe you can see it there. Has been counterbored, and that's pretty common on antique Mosins. Most antique Mosins have been counterbored. It's pretty much an anomaly if you find an antique Mosin that has not been counterbored. That's just the way they are, folks. I think pretty much everybody just accepts that. But overall, a really cool, interesting Dragoon rifle. Although we don't know if it was necessarily used by a Dragoon troop just based off of our postcard we saw. And that, folks, is just the beginning. We got a lot more cool stuff to cover this week. And in our next episode, we're going to be talking about World War I use cases of the Dragoon rifle. And we're going to be looking at some of the actual Dragoon troops, as well as some other troops that weren't Dragoons. And I don't want to spoil it, but it's going to be really interesting. And I'll give you all a hint. If you have any, or know any women that are interested in history of women on the battlefield, especially in the First World War, they're going to want to see the next video. So I'll just leave that with you as a passing thought. But thanks for taking a look at this Dragoon with me. I always love looking at cool Mosins, and this guy is, well, no different. So I hope y'all are excited about our next episode, taking a look at another cool Dragoon. We're going to look at another neat Dragoon and a lot of other cool stuff, in particular in regards to World War I. So I hope y'all are excited about that. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing. If you like more Mosin Nagant content like this, let me know if y'all have any prayer requests, and we'll see you next time.